Welcome to the third of 5 webinars being held on successive days this week under the title After Strangeways. My name is Dr. David Scott, and I will be hosting this morning's webinar, which is focused on the failure of prison reform after the 1991 Wolf Report. The 5 webinars mark the 30th anniversary of the publication of the official inquiry by Lord Justice Wolf and Sir Stephen Tuman into the April 1990 Strangeways prison protest, which was the longest and most significant protest in British penal history. The Wolf Report was published in February 1991, which was 30 years ago this week. During this webinar, you can use the Q&A function to put questions to the panelists. If you see a question from someone that you would like to see answered, you can give it a thumbs up using the upvote function, and this will increase the chances that we come to it during the session. I'm ably assisted today from behind the scenes by Neela and Matt from the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies, so many thanks to them both. And also a great many thanks to Richard Garside of the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies and Professor Joe Sim of Liverpool John Moores University, who've worked hard over the last few months to bring this important and timely 5-day webinar series to you. At this morning's webinar, we'll be hearing from 5 speakers. Each speaker will have 10 minutes each, so that we have a good half hour at the end for questions and answers. In a bit, Diane Curry, Chief Executive of Partners of Prisoners, a support group for prisoners' families that played an active role supporting families during the aftermath of the Strangeways protest, will be speaking. Diane will be followed by a talk by Alan White, Editor-in-Chief of Politics Home and author of Shadow State, Inside the Secret Companies That Run Britain. We will then hear from Kate Paradine, Chief Executive of Women in Prison, a national charity that delivers support for women affected by the criminal justice system in prisons, in the community and through its Women's Centre. Last but not least, we will hear from Richard Garside, Director of the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. First, though, I would like to introduce Katuna Sintanze, Co-Director of the Zahid Mubarak Trust, an independent national charity founded by the family of 19-year-old Zahid Mubarak, who was murdered by his racist cellmate on the morning of his release from Feltham Young Offenders Institution. So, without any further ado, over to you, Katuna.
Thank you, David, and hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. As David introduced, Zahid Mubarak Trust was established by the family of the 19-year-old Zahid, who was murdered by his racist cellmate on the morning of the release from Feltham Young Offenders Institution in March 2000. Following a lengthy campaign by the family, a public inquiry chaired by Justice Keith reported in 2006, detailing the 186 opportunities missed by the prison service that could have had avoided this tragedy. 20 years on since Zahid's death, we are still here advocating for racial justice in the prison system, for the reforms promised by the inquiry that could have stopped avoidable deaths and miseries experienced by prisoners and their families. It is a pleasure to talk about one of the most critical events in the history of the prison service, the Strangeways riots, subsequent inquiry, and the impact of its final report. I want to focus on one of many key topics covered in the report: justice in prisons, and more specifically, racial justice. Justice is a complex and umbrella concept that applies to every prisoner regardless of their race, ethnicity, or any other identity. Authorities owe justice to everyone deprived of their liberty, because the human cost of injustice is a too high price to pay. An abiding sense of injustice amongst prisoners contributed to the Strangeways riots. The inquiry made a clear and compelling argument on how the lack of justice impacts the maintenance of order and running a prison with purpose. It introduced the concept of justice in the context of the prison services obligation to treat prisoners with humanity and fairness in all aspects of prison life. The same elements that matter to prisoners now, just as much they mattered 30 years ago. Incentives, complaints, representation, and purpose, only a few to name. Some things have changed fundamentally following the inquiry report, whilst other elements, such as conditions in prisons, remain a matter of concern. What has changed for prisoners in terms of their experiences of justice and fairness? I will not be able to answer this question in its broad context, but I can certainly bring to your attention the experiences of prisoners of Black, Asian, Irish traveller, Gypsy, and other ethnic minority communities. Over the last 20 years, racial equality has been on and off the prison's reform agenda. Said's murder and public inquiry uncovered some uncomfortable reality of race relations in the prison system. The most recent event, the Lamy Review publication in 2017, described as another push for the reforms to the right direction. It is fair to say that the lessons and the recommendations from at least 11 high-profile inquiries and reviews over the last 3 decades have provided us with recipes for a radical shake-up of the system for fair and effective justice. But does it ensure equal justice for ethnic minority prisoners? The current ethnic makeup of the prison population is very different from that during the Strangeways riots. In the early 90s, minority ethnic prisoners represented around 6% of the prison population. Last year, the number reached 27%. Such a considerable increase cannot be explained simply by the growing prison population, as the overrepresentation rate of ethnic minority people is much higher now than it was 30 years ago. A collective sense of injustice would be the most precise description of prisoners' and families' experiences from ethnic minority communities. Injustice persists and is arguably getting worse over the years. The inspection reports, academic research, and thematic reviews continuously highlight disproportionately negative perceptions, treatment of, and outcomes for ethnic minority prisoners. These groups are more likely to be on the lowest level of incentives, more likely to report having been recently restrained or placed in segregation. Last year, inspectors found that prison staff underestimated the cultural requirements of ethnic minority prisoners. A third of them said that ethnicity directly influenced their rehabilitation and resettlement planning. In 2017, our joint report with the Prison Reform Trust found that ethnic minority prisoners had low confidence in the complaint system, and only 1% of prisoner complaints of racial discrimination were upheld. The Lamy Review highlighted the lack of trust towards and amongst the ethnic minority prisoners, undermining their rehabilitation and resettlement outcomes. They are more likely to experience the heavy weight of the system through security and control rather than justice and fairness. Some inspection reports highlight that discrimination complaints are inadequately investigated due to long delays, prisoners' lack of confidence, and that prisons often fail to collect the equalities data to address some long-standing disparities. Overrepresentation and negative outcomes for these groups remain officially unexplained, which leaves it open to different interpretations. Evidence of racial disparities in the criminal justice system may activate implicit stereotypical associations linking ethnic minority individuals with crime, violence, and aggression, and their overrepresentation becomes expected or even justifiable. Therefore, the authorities must do more to explain racial disparities. The charity sector has taken on duty to offer context, challenge associations, and highlight systemic failures. Until we address a mounting sense of injustice among the ethnic minority prisoners and their families, it will remain both damaging and dangerous, not only for the service in achieving its aims, but also for building the confidence of ethnic minority communities in the justice system. We have had many examples of what is at stake when the system loses its focus, balance, and purpose. No justice system, in my opinion, starved of trust and legitimacy, can ever succeed in creating safer communities. We must find a way to reduce racial disparities without creating unnecessary polarization. And we must move beyond merely discussing the problem to firmly focusing on solutions. The time for talking is over. Findings from the past inquiries and reviews already have provided the blueprint for penal policies and reforms. Without a doubt, authorities put in place ambitious plans and procedures to implement them. But these plans are often reactive rather than proactive and fail to fully transform the negative experiences of prisoners. The Prison Services Race Review 2008 is a good example of how well-intended actions and commitment were cut short by changing priorities. The Wolf Report also acknowledges the service's positive approach to race relations, but highlights erratic compliance with policy and inconsistent monitoring of outcomes. The report recommended devoting more energy to exploring incidents with racial elements, no different to what we still ask 30 years later. In terms of moving forward, we need to see racial justice as part of the broader concept of justice for prisoners, which, if neglected, can have catastrophic results. We need to address persistent systemic issues rather than counting the implemented recommendations. We also need to move away from short-term implementation targets to long-term commitments, from molding the prison reform to fit the political agenda to shaping the policies to fit the purpose of restoring humanity and hope of the system. Until then, report recommendations will continue to merely scratch the surface of the systemic injustice, and warning lapses in others would undermine heroic achievements in some areas. Until then, justice cannot be equal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katina. That was fabulous, and you did exceptionally well there in terms of keeping to time as well. And so many very, very important points there raised in terms of this notion of justice and racial justice. And I think it's really important how you kind of highlighted that in terms of the context of trust, legitimacy, and safety. And I suppose it's kind of maybe just one very, very brief question on where we are now before we kind of move on to the next speaker is, do you think that there's prospects, I mean, you've already kind of touched on this, there's this prospect for racial justice. Do you see any kind of hope of that coming in the near future in terms of moving towards developing racial justice in prisons? Or do we need to actually think maybe beyond the kind of the prison context in terms of trying to achieve racial justice?
David, that's a really complex question. I will try to answer it really shortly, not to take up other brilliant speakers' time. I guess in terms of hope and solutions, we won't be here if we don't believe in changing systems. It has been 20 years since Zaid's family and all of us to campaign for justice. And we work very closely with prisons, with the prison service to make sure that the lessons are learned. And we do hope that those inquiry recommendations will make change at some point. However, we do ask for radical shake-up. It has to be new approach. It has to be long-term strategy, and it has to be done in conjunction with the families and prison livers and the charities representing the communities currently overrepresented across the criminal justice system, and particularly in the prison system.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Katina. That's an absolutely brilliant answer. Can I just, before we move on to Diane, just encourage everybody who's watching and listening to pretty much look onto the Q&A and to submit questions, and we'll try and address those as we go through the rest of the session. But for now, I'll just hand over to Diane.
Hi, everybody. I've had some problems this morning with IT, so forgive me. Can everybody hear me?
Yep, we can hear you good, Diane.
Thank you very much. I just wanted clarification on that. Just let me get that a little better. Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Diane Curry, and I'm the Chief Exec of an organisation called POPS, Partners of Prisoners. And I'd like to firstly thank Richard and his team for the Centre of Crime and Justice for inviting me here today to take part in these webinars and to share my thoughts and views in relation to families and their role and their experiences at the time of the Strangeways riots and since. I'd also like to say thank you, David, for introducing the formalities. On April the 1st, 1990, news started to break that there was a prison disturbance at Strangeways. My husband had served many sentences, unfortunately, and spent time in Strangeways prison as a result of his offending. But like a lot of people, he wasn't in the prison at the time, but like a lot of people in Manchester, we knew people who were. And as the news started to break that something was happening within the prison, we started to get worried and we started to get nervous. POPS as an organisation was in its early formation as a network support for families. And even though we were at very early days and we only had volunteers primarily to assist us in those times, what we did is my predecessor, Frida Anderson, she rallied the troops, so to speak, to go down to the prison environment and to offer support to families who were there at that time in order to give them support and assistance in any way that we could. She reported back at the time about what she saw. She was heavily pregnant also at that time. And yet, like I say, she found herself on the front line for a good week or two before she had to go into hospital to have a baby. But she said the noise was deafening. Helicopters circled the protesters on the roof. Camera bulbs were flashing. Sirens were constantly wailing from the numerous police, fire and ambulance vehicles that were coming and going. The media circus turned up, bringing with it burger vans and the eyes of the world. People not connected to the prison turned up to add their support, but generally because it was felt early on that this particular protest was different and it was potentially what could be known as a game changer. Families were shouting up to their loved ones. Some were crying, some were in shock, and many began to feel fearful as the false news reports of rising numbers of dead bodies was being circulated. Families of the men on the roof watched as they precariously positioned themselves and kind of had to watch as they was also tried to be brought down from the roof by the use of water cannons and other tools that the services tried to do. As well as the noise, there was the light. The response services had installed megawatt lighting to shine up on the roof 24 hours a day. During the day, it wasn't as noticeable, but at night it cast an eerie glow on the sky. As families of men who spent time in the prison and families of those caught up in the current situation, we watched, we waited, and we worried. How did it ever get to this? Well, you have already heard about the conditions in the prison, and from a family's perspective, they felt their pain. Maintaining contact with our loved ones at the time was hard going. Pre-riot, visiting the prison was a humiliating and physically difficult process. There was no book visit system. Turning up outside the prison in all weathers, with children in tow, often hours before a visit started, was the norm. There were very few visitor centres at that time where we could wait to be processed with dignity. Strangeways did have a building used by families across the street from the main gate, but that was taken over as a command suite when the riot began, leaving families to gather with each other for comfort on the street. In 1990, our ongoing contact with our loved ones centred around experiencing the indignity of a visit, of ignoring the attitude of some staff, of waiting, like I said, in all weathers to be allowed into the prison, and of listening to our loved ones complain about the conditions in which they were housed. It was difficult to hear about the cramped conditions they were living with, of the slopping out and the lack of respect that staff had for prisoners and vice versa. We waited for the prison issue letters that sometimes never came, although our loved ones insisted they were sent, and of the building resentment towards staff that knew they had held those letters back for no reason other than they knew it would cause us distress. We heard this week about the attitude back then of staff towards prisoners. Well, that attitude reached out towards families also. We were seen as collusive, a nuisance. We were viewed suspiciously at best, And at worst, we're often on the receiving end of vicious and derisory comments from staff that were spoken loudly enough for us to hear and to make our visit experience as difficult as could be. For those families from diverse cultural backgrounds, they would run the gauntlet of some prison staff who were openly racist in their views and who felt comfortable in those days in that environment in sharing them. The 25 days that prisoners held the city of Manchester at a standstill came to an end as abruptly as it started, but not without families requesting if they could assist in coaxing their loved ones down from the roof by speaking to them directly. Many families felt that if they had the chance to talk to their loved ones, their sons, their partners, they would have considered coming down much sooner. But our voice was again not acknowledged. Instead, they preferred the negotiations of prison staff and others, and yet some men stated that they did indeed come down because it was what their families wanted. The following public inquiry into the riot, the Wolf Report, to which POPs contributed, addressed the issues of lack of decency and of the prison culture, and Martin Nerium, who became head of the prison service in 1988, continued with the decency agenda. Since then, and under that decency agenda, we have challenged, supported, influenced and welcomed changes to the visiting experience. Most prisons now have an associated visitor centre where families can go, shelter from the elements, use the facilities, including refreshments and access support and advice. A lot of prison visits areas are now modern and clean, with play facilities, refreshment areas as stated, and additional family days activities. These improvements came off the back of the riot and of the learning from the Wolf Report about how visitors should be treated. The more recent Farmer Review pushed further for families to not only be treated decently, but to be an integral part of the progressive journey of their loved one's sentence. And it's not uncommon for family-focused workers to be based within the prison regime, as well as outside in the centre. I'm trying not to paint too much of a wonderful picture of how it currently is, but I have to acknowledge that since the riots, there have been some changes, particularly in the way that families are treated and the families are received into the prison. It's not perfect, but it's certainly a major improvement from the visits that I experienced 33 years ago when I was visiting more regularly. And I think we have to look at the learning from the Wolf Report and subsequent reports in order to acknowledge that. In the main, families want the same result as everybody else, for their loved one to be able to live a crime-free life and for them to be given a chance to address any matters they need to work with or work on to achieve this. Listening to the previous accounts this week of the reasons or the potential reasons for the 1990 riot and of the conditions that led men to taking this action, I'm very much reminded of the situation in our prisons today. As a response to COVID lockdown restrictions, men and women have been locked in cells for up to 23 hours, not just for 1 day, 1 week or 1 month, but for over 7,750 hours, 337 days, 48 weeks, almost 12 months. Take whichever kind of sum you prefer to describe that. There is no slapping out, of course, these days, but they have had to spend all their time with at least one other person, sometimes not of their choosing, in the same room as their toilet. Families have informed me recently that in some prisons there has been no access to showers, or where there have, the water has been running cold only. Exercise has had to be taken at the expense of some other vital activity, and cellular insulation, I do believe, has left its mark. So although the reasons for those conditions are vastly different, I think we do have to look at what the subsequent impact of that will be as COVID lockdown restrictions are eased. Families have not seen their loved one in all that time period. Children are confused and anxious. Some families did manage to grab a socially distanced, mask-wearing visit in the sterile visits room for a short period when lockdown eased slightly mid-year. But there was no physical contact. Children couldn't hug their dad, and many families voted with their feet and did not take up the visit allocation at all. These might be different reasons for similar circumstances, but the potential for damage to the men and their families is a cause for concern, and we should be planning for how we support a post-COVID relaxation of lockdown. My final words today echo that of POPs of the family support and other family support agencies. Families are vital in supporting, communicating and motivating their loved one to progress their sentence positively, and it's often to us that they will return. I know there are some prisoners who don't or shouldn't have contact with their families, and their needs are also a priority. But where you have family support available to you, remember families are your greatest asset and should not be seen as your biggest problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that excellent talk and for highlighting so many important issues there, both in historical context, but also in terms of the current context with regards to COVID and the lockdown and the implications that has in terms of families. Just one quick question before we move on to the next presentation from Cara Jardine, who's written a brilliant presentation, Diane. Do you think it's easier now for the voices of families to be heard by criminal justice professionals and policymakers? Do you think they're listened to? Sorry, Diane, I think you're still on mute.
Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you. Easy is probably not the word I would use, but I understand the sentiment and the why it was asked. Yes, I suppose is my knee-jerk response, because at the same time, we do have a lot of ways that we can access decision makers, either at a local level, governors of individual prisons, right through to policymakers at the highest level. In the days when I was visiting regularly, as I said before, there was a massive barrier between the prison and the visitor or the public generally. So I do believe it is a little easier for families to get their concerns raised, their issues raised. They can use their own platforms of Twitter and use other connecting platforms. But I do believe that, yes, it is easier. Are they listening? I suppose I have to be fair, and this is about what we've learned from the Strangeways riot. Yes, I do believe they listen. Do they act, I suppose, is the question that we need to be answering in more depth. But yes, to cut the long response short, it is easier for families to get their needs highlighted. It is easy to get prison and other associated staff to listen. I suppose the difficulty for agencies like POPs and for all of us in this room is, how do we get them to act?
Thank you, Dan. That's a brilliant point of kind of highlighting the issue of listening and hearing also engages responsiveness and actually acknowledgement and doing things. And that's a really great place to end that particular part of the discussion. If we now, though, move on to Alan. So, Alan, if you're kind of okay to come in now, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hey there. Thanks very much to Richard and Centre for Crime and Justice for having me this morning. A brief introduction to myself. My name's Alan White. I currently run a website, a magazine about politics, but before that life I was a reporter, and a lot of my reporting focused on the outsourcing industry. So sort of what I'm bringing to this discussion, the story really starts roughly 20 years after Strangeways, when I was looking at the outsourcing industry across the board in a series of articles called The Shadow State that later sort of turned into a book. And it's interesting to sort of look at the industry and see the different ways in which it works. So for some sectors, it's actually, you know, outsourcing does get a terrible press, and a lot of that's justified. For some sectors, you know, the outsourcing experiment has actually worked quite well, generally with more kind of simple things like buying stationery for offices and bin collections and that sort of thing. I would honestly say that the sector where it feels to me like the biggest gambles have been taken and have not come off and have in fact been disastrous is the justice sector. I think that we are currently in a period of retreat, really. And that's born of a combined set of failures, all of which were going on around the time I was doing my reporting. Probably the three obvious ones that will be across the sort of the radars of most of the people watching this are obviously Birmingham, the tagging fiasco, and transforming rehabilitation. It seems to me that in recent times there's been a sort of step away from sticking with privatization for unpaid work and other activities in the post-transforming rehabilitation service. It doesn't look to me like existing public sector prisons are going to be sort of, I think those plans are going to be abandoned, and probably Birmingham is a factor in that. that said, the sort of new prison bills that will be run by the same outsourcing companies that most of us are familiar with. They'll still be running tagging, and the MOJ is wedded to a sort of mixed market, mostly in prisons. But I think the last few years have sort of left some quite deep scars on the relationship between the justice sector and the outsourcing sector, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why. So to start with prisons, I guess, is the obvious one, and this is a sort of I apologize for those of you who know all of this background, but I think it's sort of quite important. The prisons system, when I looked at it, outsourced prisons were underperforming in the performance rankings. They were generally many were in need of kind of urgent improvements. Looking at a quick survey of that now, actually across the sort of outsourced prison board, they don't fare that much worse than the ones that are being run by HMP. I suspect a fairly big reason for that is HMP Birmingham, which, you know, in the wake of Strangeways, is probably the next great disaster across the prison's timeline. So a quick recap of that: G4S, which is a sort of outsourcing firm that I'm sure most of you know, took over the day-to-day running of that prison in 2011. There were problems pretty much from the get-go. They had to spend money replacing the keys and the locks because they'd lost master keys. There were assaults by prisoners that were rising, an average of 3 a week on staff, and by prisoners on other prisoners, confirmation of drugs being brought into the prison, and that escalating the violence. Prison inspectors kind of confirmed that. There was even, I believe, a confirmation that a very small minority of staff were sort of corrupt by the company. I did an interview with Jerry Petherwick, who was the head of the sort of prisons estate in G4S in, I think, 2016. And it was really interesting because Petherwick was a former sort of, he'd worked in the state sector before moving over to G4S, and he made some relatively compelling arguments in favour of privatised prisons along the lines that actually he felt they were much more rigorously kind of overseen and held far more accountable than state prisons. And kind of hilariously, he pointed to HMP Birmingham as the sort of a great model. He said, you know, there's been this report that we've had commissioned into it, and it shows that not only have we sort of driven down costs, but we have the capacity to deal with problems in a way that the state sector can't. Well, literally weeks later, there was a gigantic riot there, and 2 years later, the government announced that it was taking Birmingham Prison back into state hands. Chief Inspector of Prison described it as the worst prison he'd ever been to. Dramatic deterioration in conditions post the riot. Talk of, you know, blood, vomit, rat droppings on the floor, abject failure to manage and deliver the contract. You know, it was an absolute kind of hammering for the company. And, you know, ministers basically sort of had to intervene. There were even calls for the Secretary of State to resign. So I think in the wake of Strangeways, it's probably the major kind of prison story of the last 20 years. And, you know, it is something that I think is going to affect the way that we think about prisons in the private sector going forward. Now, as I say, when you look across the whole estate, the picture is not as it was, where the sort of the bulk of privatized prisons are performing noticeably worse than state-run. But there are obviously there are certain issues that are brought into light when you outsource stuff, and they're quite common across all the different sectors of health, housing, and all the rest of it. Probably the big one for me is transparency. So A good example of this was I had a long sort of debate with Rupert Soames, who's the head of Serco, over the fact that in HMP Bronzefield, the women there were doing a sort of rehabilitation scheme that involved making handbags for Anya Hindmarch. And this had sort of been revealed by, I think, as I recall, journalists that this scheme, you know, was basically creating designer handbags. And Rupert was quite sort of aggrieved at the way I'd portrayed this, and kind of said, you know, well, this is a good thing for them. It's, you know, we're helping them out. Why should we be pilloried for that? They're learning skills that they can take out to the wider world. And my point was that that may well be the case. That's absolutely fine. But why is it taking journalists to reveal this? Why isn't there transparency? And you see that with a lot of those sort of initiatives another one where they were running call centers for an insurance company, where you can't find out the name of the company that's profiting from the labor of the prisoners. Now, to my mind, that's just, irrespective of the merits of the scheme and the good intentions that might be behind it, that lack of transparency is a worrying thing. And you know, you also see that on a wider scale with contracts, you know, and part of the reason you choose to outsource stuff is that it saves money. But what isn't clear, because of commercial confidentiality, is how that money is being saved. And, you know, the suspicion ever since sort of Birmingham is that it involves a decrease in the quality of service. So those are quite sort of fundamental, ongoing outsourcing worries that people like me talk about with every sector. Another thing that I looked at, and was a true catastrophe, was this transforming rehabilitation scheme, which was brought in by Chris Grayling. I was stunned, I think in 2013, where the head of the Probation Association sort of called me in for a meeting and just said, you know, basically, we're outsourcing the probation service and this is going to be an absolute disaster. They've given us no heads up. They haven't thought about how you manage risk. You know, it's fine to sort of quantify stuff like, as I say, selling paper clips, but you can't quantify how people act. You can't sort of put someone in a bracket of they are a low risk offender and expect them to kind of stay there. And they've not really given any thought to, you know, how the companies are going to manage that and how you're going to move between private and public. You know, it's just a disaster in the making. And I sort of went, well, this is sort of pretty explosive. How can I, you know, report it out? And he just said to me, it's fine, it's all on record. Quite happy to say this publicly. And, you know, when you have the head of the Probation Association saying that sort of stuff openly, you would think that government would call the wisdom of the moves that they were making into question, but they didn't. They pressed on. And lo and behold, sort of 3 years later, the National Audit Office basically produces an absolute hammer blow of a report into the privatisation of the service. You know, they say that companies are manipulating, withholding data from government agency, which is, you know, an ongoing thing. It's not just, we'd actually seen all this play out with the work program, which was, you know, run by the DWP, and for unemployed people, they'd seen exactly the same dynamic happen and just cracked on anyway, which I will never understand how they thought that it was a good idea, you know. And so we sort of fast forward to 2020, and the probation services get restored back to public ownership and control. So a lot of this stuff is tiresomely kind of predictable and sort of frustrating to report out, really, when people are telling you exactly how it's going to go from day one. Tagging, I just briefly touch on a similar kind of thing, where it's a constant outsourcing thing where you introduce a profit incentive, and that, you know, it kind of can encourage people to cook the books. Now, I'm not saying that that doesn't happen in the state sector, because state sector stuff has targets too, but it just adds an extra layer. And we've already seen with tagging, you know, with bits and pieces of the work program, etc., that it happens. And so, you know, you sort of have to be careful with how you introduce these schemes. I'll just very quickly touch on the fact that with that transparency stuff, I think one area that doesn't get talked about very much and that we should be talking about more, and it's to my horror that we don't, is secure training centres, where there have been a string of revelations about, in particular, the use of force on young people as a way of control, and we are something of an outlier in allowing that to happen. And the outsourcing factor adds another layer of difficulty over the transparency with it. You know, are these staff following the rules? It's quite hard to see exactly what rules they should be following and whether they are. And once it was revealed that the staff weren't following the rules a few years ago, you know, lawyers had to sort of try and find these children who, it transpired retrospectively, had suffered abuse in order for them to make claims. It's shocking to me that after that panorama on Medway STC, that it's continued to receive inadequate inspection judgments. I find that staggering. So that's a brief overview. I'm conscious I've slightly overrun my time slot of outsourcing and justice. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Alan. That's absolutely brilliant, mate. And some really, really significant points there that you've raised. We have one question for you, which maybe we'll kind of, you can either reflect on this, or if it's quite a long one, or come back to it now if you think you can answer it quite briefly. But the question is, the outsourcing and contracting of many essential services, including family learning and support, children's care, YOI, education, and so on and so forth, is demonstrating a significant reduction in quality of services. For example, Clinks mention contracts don't cover costs in their most recent report. Who should raise this as a principal concern, given all the different presentations and discussions that we're having today? So the question is really, who do you think should be the kind of, who should be raising this as a principal concern about outsourcing?
I'm conscious I'm massively overrun, so I'll be very quick. I think you know, there's all sorts of ways in which you can raise this. I mean, the noisiest way is to take it to journalists and let them make a fuss. But then the other way that I think you probably want to be getting this stuff out there is talking to things like the Justice Select Committee. You know, there are MPs on that committee, and it is very much their job to hold the government's feet to the fire on this stuff.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thanks for that very brief response. So we might come back to some of these issues a little bit later as we go through the day. Okay, I'd like to just move on to Kate, please. So Kate, when you're ready, if you can just jump in. Thank you very much.
Hi, David. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, got you loud and clear, Kate.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Paradigm from Women in Prison. Thanks for the introduction, David. So today I thought I would speak to you as a group of pretty converted audience who understand the harm of prison. And thanks so much to Katuna and Alan and to Diane for introducing some of the points that I don't need to cover around that harm. We know that the last year has demonstrated how deeply failing the system of prison and criminal justice is. And I know many of you will have supported us in our calls from Women in Prison for early release and for vaccinations more recently. The impact on families has been massive. And I know you know about the root causes of offending and all of the issues that bring people to prison, to which the harm of prison just makes those issues worse. So we're in an overwhelming state of failure, and we know that something has to change. Now, in terms of women, we know that there has been progress. We've got a strategy that the government has signed up to 2.5 years ago, a strategy on women to radically reduce the women's prison population, which has actually been working. So that's the bit of good news, but then we get to the desperately sad bit. A month ago, the government announced, as many of you will know, hopefully all of you by now, that they were going to build 500 new women's prison places. This is despite the fact that we've seen reductions in hundreds of women going to prison, and the prison population before the strategy was around 4,000, is now closer to around 3,200. So we're seeing a big reduction in imprisonment, and yet we are building new women's prison places. So something is going badly wrong. And I thought I'd use the few minutes that I've got today to talk not about what others are doing wrong, but about what we as the converted might be doing wrong, and to think about why it is that we're in this position. So I wanted to talk about 3 ways in which I think we're not getting things right. And this includes, when I say we, I don't mean everyone else, I mean us. I mean our organisation looking differently at what we're doing, about me as a leader also looking at differently at what I'm doing. So I think there's 3 ways in which we're not getting things right. And I wanted to start the first with a quote from Joan Baez that our founder, Chris Tchaikovsky, loved, which was small victories and big defeats. She thought that we should focus on the small incremental changes and not be overwhelmed by the big defeat of a failing system. And in some ways we're doing that, but I think what we're missing is the big vision. We're missing the big shared vision that we need to work towards, which for us is abolition, is replacing the system and not being satisfied with the crumbs from the table of change, and really focusing together on what the big vision is, to really overwhelm that big defeat that we face, and to do that by focusing on small victories. And I'll talk in a couple of minutes about what I think that looks like. And the second way in which I think we're going wrong is, I'm going to start with a quote from the wonderful Audre Lorde, which is, "Your silence will not protect you." And what Alan was talking about just there around contracting and transforming rehabilitation is a classic case of believing that silence might well protect you and help you to survive. Because throughout the absolute scandalous disaster which has been transforming rehabilitation, there has been far too much silence. And that's been from across the converted, as I would describe us, across charities, across academia, where it was known what was going wrong, and in all sorts of professional groups who knew what a failure this would be. And we know some have spoken out, some of us have done it intermittently, and some of us have done it all the way along. But clearly the silence that has overwhelmed this has really enabled this failure to happen. So Audrey's point, your silence will not protect you, I think is something that we need to take away from that. And particularly larger charities that benefit from some of the contracts, but also know full well what's going wrong. And the addiction to contracts and things like that is something that I think we really need to address. Which brings me to the third way in which I think we're going wrong. And again, I'm gonna return to Audre Lorde because her quotes never fail to satisfy, and that's that the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And unfortunately, the issues around competition and growth and the illusion of evidence, using evidence when it suits you, are all the tools which we have put our shoulders to and which have not enabled us to overturn this system, and particularly competition. I think divide and rule among charities and in academia and between us all has not enabled us to really make the case for change, which is what we now really need to turn to work out why it is that we have made so little progress. A classic example to turn to Alan's point about the system of commissioning is the recent commissioning of probation services, which in itself has massive issues, very similar to transforming rehabilitation. We know from women's centres and other charities the ridiculous bureaucracy involved in getting involved in delivering in the new system. 20,000 words were put to each application on the women's lot to provide services. That's a master's thesis involving days and weeks, in some cases, of charity time, just to be able to deliver services. So what are we left with then, if we look at where I think that we're going wrong? Well, I think we're left with three things that we need to do together. One is that we need to focus on what our big vision is and really face up to the fact that reforming and tweaking the system has not worked. So what is our vision? What is the long game? And I think this is an intergenerational game. We have to face the fact that this is something that we need to build from the ground up and think about the long term, the vision for racial justice and the vision for services. We have been trying with Women's Centre partners to really portray that vision for women's services, with women's centres as a lifeline and an anchor in communities where women can be prevented from going to prison and can also find support for all the root causes of offending. I think thinking about the big vision for women and men is absolutely vital. And then I think the second thing we need to do is we need to really think about our silence and our complicity and think about how we speak out together, how we recognise power and privilege and lift up the voices of others. And really that is going to take some real rethinking for some of us about the way we do our business and the way we think about our role in the system of change. And that includes established charities like ourselves and others working in this space and really thinking about the final thing that I think we must do now. And this is, to me, is the most important, to focus on connection and collaboration between those of us that know how broken the system is, and to think about how we work opposite to the master's tools, how we undermine competition, how we refuse to play dangerous games that involve divide and rule, and how we really get underneath what has brought us to this place and think about how we do things differently. And that is going to involve a division of labour, lifting up voices. It will involve some of us stepping back and stepping away, and some of us stepping up. And that is going to be tough, and that is going to involve some rethinking of some of our established ways of thinking of the world and thinking about what our role is in it. But I wanted to end on a note of hope, because I absolutely believe that we can and will overturn the ridiculous decision to build 500 new women's prisons places. I've never seen a decision met with such ridicule, such horror, and such utter bewilderment. It is ridiculous. Everyone working on this plan in the system knows it, and those of us resisting it know it. It is ridiculous, and it needs to stop really quickly before too much money is spent on planning for these new prison places. And I think we can do it, but I think we're only really going to be able to do it if we take a good look now, really hard, about how we can do things across the system differently. And that's going to involve us looking at why it is that so few people know that 18,000 prison places for men are due to be built, despite all that's happened over the last year and all that we know about the failing system. So hopefully that's a message of hope, and we can talk in the Q&A. I hope I haven't overshot my time, David.
Kate, that was absolutely perfect. In fact, I think you've actually come in about 30 seconds in time. So absolutely fabulous. I think, and that was an absolutely amazing talk as well. I think you've highlighted so many very, very significant issues there, and I just think I love the way you've kind of put that out there in terms of, you know, needing to develop a big shared vision, the problem of silence, and the problem of using the master's tools. And I think that they're all things that perhaps we can come back and reflect upon about how we actually can go forward with that kind of vision. I've just got, really, it's a comment actually from Kay Wall to share with you before we move on to Richard, rather than a question. We have got a few questions coming in, and also just to encourage everyone in the audience to start putting in questions now for the panelists as a whole as well. So please do keep those questions coming in. But just in terms of something that Kay Wall has posted in the question and answer, and she's written more a comment, but surely this failure is so closely related to the fact that there are too many people who are making money out of the CGS, including prisons. As a practitioner in the CGS, I would be delighted to lose my job, as there would be no need for me, but would everyone, indicating that you know, exactly that point that we need to be looking for this bigger vision, as Kate's indicated, and trying to actually to step outside, but of course within the context of what Alan said as well, with regards to that hidden element there of pushing punishment for profit and so on and so forth, which I think is another significant theme and element we can perhaps reflect upon a little bit later. So Kate, what I'll do is I'll let you go for now, and what we'll do is we'll bring in Richard for his discussion, and then we'll come back to all the panelists for about 20 odd minutes or so, 20-25 minutes that we'll have in terms of actually moving forward with broader questions. So please do, for those who are listening, please do kind of send your questions in now. Thank you. Okay, over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you to Katuna and Alan and Diane and Kate for 4 really great presentations. I think those are all pretty difficult to follow. I'll do my best. To understand where we're going in prisons, I think it's important that we understand where we've come from. And it's important to think about where particularly the law and order agenda, which so kind of in some ways so scars our political process, comes from. So law and order themes first appeared in party election manifestos with the 1959 general election. And from the 1970s on, these themes became more and more prominent, with a growing political consensus across all the main parties for the need for tougher law and order policies. The Conservative election victory in 1979 was something of a turning point, and indeed in many ways, though it built on what came before. The Conservative manifesto during that election bemoaned what it described as a growing disrespect for the rule of law, and it identified a number of enemies of the law, and these included violent criminals and thugs, hooligans, immigrants, the young unemployed in ethnic communities, strike committees and pickets, terrorism and convicted terrorists, and also the Labour Party itself. And this worldview reached its purest expression, I think, in many ways during the year-long miners' strike of 1984-85, when the government deployed the police and the criminal law to target striking miners. Another sign of the barely repressed tensions and social conflicts of that period came on the 31st of March 1990, when an estimated 200,000 people gathered in central London to protest the introduction of the poll tax. The organisers claim that the police attacked them indiscriminately, and indeed one police officer reportedly remarked, quote, "I think we lost it a bit." Hundreds were left injured. The following day, the 25-day Strangeways prison disturbance kicked off, the largest and longest of a number of prison disturbances to break out that month. And the connection between those prison disturbances and the poll tax demonstration was remarked on at the time. One prison officer in Dartmoor, which was one of the prisons that was disturbances broke out, said that the prison disturbances should be put in the context of other riots, such as the London poll tax riot the night before the Strangeways riot. And he said a large percentage of prisoners see themselves either as unjustly imprisoned or overly oppressed while in prison. Now, I offer this brief history to put in context the Strangeways protest. It was overdetermined by many developments and cross currents in wider society. There were also some specific factors distinctive to the prison system that were long-standing and deep-rooted. As the Wolf Report itself pointed out, the Strangeways protests and other prisons, about those protests, and he said that prison riots cannot be dismissed as one-off events or as local disasters or a run of bad luck. They're symptomatic of a series of underlying difficulties in the prison system. Now, it's often said that prisons policy took a punitive turn after the Strangeways prison protest, particularly with the appointment of Michael Howard as Home Secretary in 1993. At the time, the Home Secretary, rather than as today, the Justice Secretary, was responsible for our prisons. Prison works, Michael Howard told the Conservative Party conference a few years after Strangeways. It ensures that we are protected from muggers and murderers and rapists and it makes many who are tempted to commit crime think twice. And in the 25 years following Howard's speech, the male prison population nearly doubled, and the women's prison population, though numerically much smaller, grew by even more, by around 150%. Developments since the Strangeways protests, the toughening of sentences, the growth in the prison population, the tightening of security in prisons, can certainly be seen as a rejection of Woolf's observation about the underlying factors of prison riots. And it's also, I think, something of a two-fingered salute by the British establishment to the Strangeways protesters and other prisoners whose legitimate grievances have been left unaddressed. But if the years since the Strangeways protests have been marked by intensifying punitiveness, this is also part of a longer story. In the years between the Second World War and the late 1960s, for instance, the prison population more than doubled. And it's grown a further 150% since the late 1960s. And the Strangeways protests, while the largest prison protest there has ever been in the UK, at least so far, itself forms part of a long history of prison protests and prisoner resistance against the brutality and violence they face. 20 years before Strangeways, a short-lived standoff between staff and prisoners in Parkhurst prison in the Isle of Wight, the standoff itself lasted less than an hour, left 12 prison officers and at least 35 prisoners injured. Reports of prison officer brutality were widespread. The wife of one prisoner told the Times that her husband had 8 wounds in his head and some of his fingers were broken and bandaged. 2 witnesses saw a prison officer grab a prisoner saying, "I have been waiting for this, you black bastard." At least one of the protesters, the Richardson gang veteran Frankie Fraser, took a severe beating, according to a prison medical doctor, leaving his eyesight and sense of balance permanently damaged. During the subsequent trial of 9 of the protesters, it emerged that prisoners returning to their cells were forced to run a gauntlet of prison officers lining the corridors who beat them as they ran past. In his account of life in Parkhurst in the period leading up to the 1969 disturbance, Brian Stratton detailed that many petty rules and regulations and outright staff brutality that contributed to the subsequent protest. Indeed, Stratton recounts his own warning to MPs delivered a few months before the Parkhurst standoff that there will be a riot unless you get something done to stop the brutality. As Joe Sim, one of the co-organisers of this webinar, has argued, the story of the past 50 years in prisons is not one of a fall from liberalism into punitiveness following the Strangeways protest, but of ongoing, intensifying punitiveness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. That was excellent. Thank you so much for locating the discussions around the injustice following the Woolf report within that longer historical analysis and connecting it back to various different prison disturbances in the past. I think that's really, really very, very important to have that long notion of the history of prisons, and as you noted then, the symptomatic and underlying issues which come from prisons, whether that be in the 19th century, the 20th century, or indeed the 21st century. And that's really, really important that we recognise that many, many of the issues that we face today were also things that we actually have confronted and been challenged with in the past. I've just got a couple of comments here, really, to share with you, Richard, just to kind of to have this is kind of part of the context. But Nicola Beglin has thanked you for the inspiration and indicating that there's much more collaboration is needed, as the webinars that you've organised are showing. And also, Joanna Foster has, while she was speaking, has written excellent, powerful reference to the miners' strike and the enemy within. The enemy being communities fighting not for increased wages or improved working conditions, but simply the right to work. Thank you, Richard. So I think there's been some really, really kind of significant pointers raised there. Richard, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to bring the panel back in. And we've got actually quite a large number of questions to get through. So I'm going to start by just having a few individual or collective questions to our panelists. And then what we'll then do is we'll open up to questions for all of the panelists. So I think that seems to be one way. We've got about 25 minutes, so hopefully we'll get through about 4 or 5 questions. I'd just like to start though with a question which has been directed to Katuna. And the question that's been raised, or one of the questions that's been raised, and there's been a number of questions actually that have reflected upon what Katuna has said. And I know that Katuna has also kind of been answering some of these in the Q&A box, which is excellent. So thank you very much for that already, Katuna. But just to this one question here is, do you think prisons are part of the solution to racial justice or part of the problem? So maybe we'll start with Katuna and see if anybody else wants to jump in on that.
Thank you, David. It is really important question. I think we all need to ask this question to ourselves as practitioners, as members of our communities, as members of society. And it's about what do we try to get out of prisons. We have evidence and compelling evidence about how deterrence is not working, how prisons are not effective in achieving its aims and purpose. I think when it comes to solutions, I'd love to think that solutions lay beyond the criminal justice system, before even if it comes to prisons and the criminal justice system itself. And we need to think about this outside the criminal justice system as well. We have to think about those solutions together. But I'd like also to highlight that sometimes we do miss that the experiences in the prisons, in the prison system, affects people's outcomes when it comes to their rehabilitation and resettlement. So it does not mean that we should take our eyes off what happens at prisons, but it certainly should not be viewed as the one and only solution. I think we need to be much braver and bold in offering solutions.
Thank you, Katuna. That's an excellent answer. Thank you so much for sharing your your thoughts. I was going to say your shorts with us, but not your shorts, your thoughts. So that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. I was going to move on to the next question, unless anybody else on the panel wants to actually come in very quickly with an additional response with regards to issues around racial justice. No, okay, we'll move on to our next set of questions, and this is directed specifically to Alan and Kate. Much of what you speak of seems to relate to the ever-deepening enmeshment of prisons within the penal industrial complex. At what point does silence become complicity? For example, third sector bidding for CRC contracts, developments such as TR, are ideologically driven after all. So maybe if we just kind of start with Alan and then move on to Kate, and then we'll open it up for if anyone else on the panel has any further contributions. So maybe if we just move to Alan.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for charities and small providers in some of this. Obviously, one of the things that I didn't get a chance to talk about with referring to probation was this payment by results thing, where you would have the big contractors and then called primes, and then you have subprimes. I'm sure lots of people listening know about all this, and so you're sort of managing 2 tiers of relationship. And I'm not aware of it happening with regards to TR, but certainly with other big government sort of outsourcing ventures, smaller companies have actually gone bust, because of the way that it's been managed. And there's also been, complaints along the lines of, we work on an IT project, for example, and it's like sort of being sat on by an elephant. But equally, we can't really go out and bite the hand that feeds us. So, you know, there is a basic point around survival, you know, for charities and small providers, which I totally sympathise with. The question is, are there other stakeholders who can safely bring those concerns to light without any kind of retribution or payback? I don't know. You know, there are always ways to get kind of information out there into the public domain, but it always seems to involve a risk of some kind. So, you know, the answer to it is on the government side and on rigorous kind of auditing and rigorous oversight. There have been steps to address that with the outsourcing, I think it's called the Outsourcing Handbook, that got published by the Cabinet Office a couple of years ago. Are they acting on everything in there? Jury's very much out. I don't really have a satisfactory answer for you for that one. I think it is very, very difficult, would be my short kind of response.
Thank you, Alan. Kate?
Yeah, just really quickly, because I know you've got lots of questions to get through. I mean, this comes back from my perspective to my point about collaboration, because Alan, obviously we are one of those charities that you sympathise with in terms of we provide in the system. We know full well all about the the payoffs around this and the difficulties and the fears around your staff and your services being under threat. But the thing that we're finding, and this we learned from transforming rehabilitation from this when we withdrew from contracts that had gagging clauses that we wouldn't sign up to, that actually the way forward here is together. And what we're doing at the moment with other women's centre providers is we've written a number of letters and we're challenging various elements of the system together so that it's much harder for us to be picked off. And I think there's Clinks, there's Lloyds Bank Foundation and Paul Streets, and I think they're doing some amazing work around drawing attention to this through things like the procurement green paper consultation and things like this. That actually the silence of the press, I think, is really important. And Alan's point about TR was known in the public domain, what a disaster that was, and still there isn't really interest in what it means. So I think for me, the answer goes back to, I think the public needs to be much more aware of what all of this means in practice. And I know that's easier said than done.
If I could quickly add to that, that's bang on in my view, Kate. And it's weird how a lot of these issues have somehow been turned into something that only like the Guardian should care about. It's nonsense. You know, if you're a Tory and you believe in the free market, you should be as furious about this as anyone else. Times should be covering it aggressively. Telegraph should be covering it aggressively. It shouldn't be a left-wing thing. And I think Kate's point on the gagging clauses is really key. And that is a government thing. That is their choice to operate in that way. And they should absolutely be held to account for it.
Thank you both. That's fabulous. Does anybody else on the panel want to come in and respond to that particular question before we move on to the next one? No. Okay. This is one specifically for Diane. Raised in the previous two webinars as well, which is the Corvid context. So Diane, I wonder if you could maybe give us a little bit of kind of insight into your reflections on the impact that COVID's had on prisoner families over the last 12 months.
Wow, that in itself could take another half hour or so to really give it justice. But I think we're all aware, because we've all been, you know, included in a COVID restrictive lockdown situation. So we're all aware of what that feels like to some greater or lesser degree, depending on your circumstances, your personal circumstances. But in relation to prisoners and prisoners' families, I think I mentioned, well, I know I mentioned in my presentation, if you want to break it down into the number of hours, number of days that particularly prisoners have remained not only within their homes or places where they stay, but remained in a room small enough as the size of some people's bathrooms. And I think you have to really be mindful of what that is. And I've often said to people, take your television, take your laptop, take your iPad and go and sit in your bathroom, not for an hour or a day, but for 12 months with very little exercise or other facilities. And that really tells you that although we're all in lockdown, we are we are not experiencing prison in lockdown in that way. But in relation to families have struggled. I mean, I have to admire their resilience and their robustness, but I know by talking to many families and by listening to other people who are also talking to families that they are really struggling right now in relation to, one, how they feel forgotten. They feel that they're not mentioned in any news reports, not mentioned in any bulletins. Nobody's talking about how we're going to reopen prisons this morning on Boris's conversations. So they do feel forgotten and isolated and marginalised. And then where there are localised conversations with the prison service and those responsible for the opening up of prisons and for the contact of families, there also is a lack of communication about what's going on, what's really happening, what their needs are. And I think there's lots of questions that families have that even I can't answer because I haven't got the answers. I do my very best to try and locate the answers for them, and what comes back is, no, that can't happen, no, that can't happen. So families are feeling really isolated. They're struggling in trying to maintain their own mental health and well-being, as well as being worried and concerned about the mental health and well-being of their loved one. They're trying to placate children, to inform them and try to explain to them why there has been no access, like I say, not for a few months, but for 12 months, and really desperately requiring some assistance to get their physical contact back to some normality when appropriate. I know we've had the video calling system introduced, and for some families, I do believe it has helped. But for many, it hasn't touched the surface in relation to how they access the video calling, what the quality of that calling is like, and really their capacity to engage with that kind of conversation with their loved one. You know, this isn't easy even for us today to kind of have to engage in our conversations under these circumstances. So having to engage and maintain your relationship with your loved one through these circumstances isn't for everybody. And so for many people, again, the video calling hasn't really ensured that they do get the relationship they need with their loved one. But just generally, I think most families are concerned for the welfare and the safety of their partner or their son or their daughter in the system. And nobody can really, at this moment in time, tell them anything about how that individual is. The lines of communication are shut down. Agencies like POTS do the best we can to try and get into the prison to find out what, you know, to answer their concerns. But unfortunately, it's just a difficult community. There's a difficulty in communication all around. So yeah, I think they're struggling. I know they're struggling, and I'm not really sure, other than keep conversations with the prison service, which we do, and with our local prisons, etc. And provide staff to listen to their concerns and to talk about, you know, what we can do to assist. But it's been a really, really difficult time, and I'm not sure what that's. I think again I alluded to it in my presentation. I'm not sure yet that we've really thought about what the easing of restrictions within prison regimes will look like, and of course getting visits and physical, social, interactive visits back on track. I'm not sure we've even thought about that yet.
Thank you, Diane. I think that's a really powerful account there, and kind of shows the deepening of the injustices and the exploitation and the problems that plague prisons anyway, but just obviously this current context, it's even more difficult, and the impact there on families. I wondered if anybody else on the panel wanted to quickly jump in on anything to discuss with regards to COVID. Richard's got his hand up. Richard, do you want to come in?
Just very briefly, there was a report yesterday that there's a COVID outbreak now in Strangeways. Yeah, and amongst many prisons, of course, but it did kind of strike me as kind of symptomatic of the problem. You know, that in the week we're marking the 30th anniversary of the review of the report into the protest. That's the situation in Strangeways today.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry, yep.
David,
Yeah,
may I
continue.
Thank you. Since last year, we've been running the campaign, A Record of Our Own, in partnership with Diane and the Traveller Movement and a few other specialist charities. And can I just say very briefly, the findings from the campaign is that prisons are fighting outbreaks, prevention, spread of virus, but they also face a mental health crisis. Depression, distress, anxiety, panic attacks, anger are just a few issues to highlight, highlighted to us by prison leavers, prisoners, and families. And we need to pay attention. Prisons are exhausted. And this mental health crisis is brewing there, and we need to pay very careful attention to this.
Thank you. Kate, yes?
Yeah, just really quickly, David, I think just to keep on the fact that it's not too late for the government to make the most of the positive potential to reduce the prison population with an early release scheme and with all that goes with that. And it is really frightening, actually, that there seems to be this return to the idea of increased prison population through the 20,000 police officers, which is the justification for building the new 500 women's prison places. So I think it's just holding the line, really, on that we need to focus on reducing the prison population throughout the building back that Diane's referring to. Because I agree, Diane, I don't think there's been sufficient thought given to what the next sort of 9-12 months looks like. Thanks, David.
Wonderful, thank you. We've got quite a few more questions to get through, we can, but I just want to give a quick reminder, as we've been talking there a little bit about kind of the various different ways in which injustice has been kind of developed, and as well as the failure of reform and so on, is to remind you that tomorrow we have John Crilly, Gloria Morrison, Steve Toombs, Patrick Williams and Caroline Willow talking at the same time tomorrow in the fourth of this series of the webinars, and they will be looking particularly at 30 years of injustice, and they still have opportunity to sign up for that if you so wish. Okay, what I want to do now is just to move on to one further question, which is really to all of the panelists, and it ties in actually very nicely with what Kate was talking about in terms of developing a big shared vision and how we actually need to try and go forward collectively, and something which also was raised by Rex on the very first day, the very first morning of this series. So I'd like to put this to all the panelists, but the question that we have particularly, but it's within this context of this wider vision. Who are our targets when it comes to creating change for people who are sent to prison, at risk of being sent to prison? And how do we kind of engage with the policy makers, and how do we go forward? And indeed, who are the people that we need to be kind of engaging with? So if I maybe start with Kate, as I can see she's still on screen, and then we'll go to Richard and work our way through. But we'll just start with Kate first.
So thanks. That's a great question, David. I'm not sure who that came from. I mean, for us, I think focusing on our parliamentarians is really important, and that's what we've been doing in relation to women, and really targeting the fact that this isn't. We've done the thing where you send letters to MPs in a campaign, and yes, that is a good tool to have. But for us, it's about building relationships with those in power, and really encouraging people to share that vision and to share ownership and belief in the vision for how things can be different. And for that, charities, academia and others, it's about telling stories to parliamentarians. It's about their own local areas and about how things could be different if we invested in communities and not in prisons. So for us, I think parliamentarians are key. But we know that there are so many professional groups that already are convinced. And for me, this is about bringing together the stories and the nuggets and the facts that will actually change hearts and minds of the less converted among us. And just finally, when we did our mass lobby of Parliament in 2019, we brought together women's centres and women using centres, women from prison, women released from long and short sentences, queuing up outside Portcullis House to meet MPs, many of whom I won't name, but some you might have been surprised were interested in a mass lobby by women in prison. But those stories, those meetings did make a difference. They led to relationships being built with women's centres in local communities. And we think it's that, the hard graft of building relationships for change, that will make the difference.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kate. If I now just hand over to Richard.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Kate, for that answer. Yeah, I was struck by Kate's point about the importance of investing in communities, not in prisons, and you know, that's quite central to our own thinking. We launched a program before lockdown. It got slightly disrupted because of lockdown, called After Prison. One of the kind of the central proposition of that program is that there is always a better use for a piece of land than as a place for a prison. And so what we want to do over the coming years is to work locally. I think there's a national debate about prisons, and the work with MPs and with civil servants and decision makers really important. But it's also important to remember that each prison is in a neighbourhood. Many of them, like Brixton in London, the closest prison to our office, is bang smack in the middle of a neighbourhood, actually. Others are obviously rather more remote, but people living in those communities probably have some, quite significant thoughts about prison and whether the prison should be there. If it wasn't there, what that land should be used for instead, whether it's housing or parks or leisure centres or light industrial units, whatever. So one of the things we think is really important is to re-engage that dialogue at a local level with people who are most directly impacted by prison system and by prisons in their neighbourhoods, whilst also obviously connecting that to the national debate.
Thank you, Richard. Alan, could you come in, please? Thank you. And then we'll move on to Katuna and Diane.
Yes, quite tough to improve on Kate and Richard's answers, really. Look, the reality is that throughout my lifetime, there's been this weird dual narrative on the part of especially national politicians where, they sort of dangle punitive rhetoric around, all of them completely well informed that the reality is that rehabilitation is the most important thing, and that's the only thing that they should really be measuring the success of the justice system on. The only kind of cabinet secretary who even seemed to be willing to publicly nod towards this was Michael Gove, in my opinion. So the first thing I'd say is do not be dissuaded by the stuff that you read and hear from cabinet ministers, because they actually have rather more insight than they let on. It's a PR thing. I think Kate's point about localism is absolutely correct. That in a sense the stakes are slightly lower there, and the way that this battle gets won in terms of a better justice system is one of gradualism. And it is about empowering local communities and about empowering the communities around prisons in particular, and families of those who are inside. What else would I say? I think that I think I will leave it there before I start saying things that I definitely regret.
Okay, thank you. As you mentioned families at that point at the end, Alan, should we move on to Diane, and then we'll come to Katuna to round everything up. So Diane, if you want to come in and
thank
what
you.
Alan said.
When the question was asked about who are the targets, obviously I agree with Kate and Alan. There are political targets and influencers and decision makers, and those with the inverted commas power. But my initial thought when who are the targets went back to localism, if you like what Alan alluded to, went back to families themselves, went back to the general public, communities. Communities don't always take responsibility for people that find themselves, involved in the criminal justice system, and they need to take responsibility for people that are going to return home to them. They need to have an interest. They need to show some understanding. They need to put their point of view across. So that element of localism, about drilling right down into communities, not only where prisons live. I mean, referring back to Strangeways. Strangeways in Manchester it's an iconic building. Whether you understand criminal justice or not, you know where it is, you know what it looks like, you have a thought or an idea about what goes on inside of it. It's probably not strictly true or reflective, but it's certainly a conversation starter for local communities to kind of get them to be responsible, if you like, for understanding what does go on in that prison and how they can assist and how they can influence potentially what goes on in that prison, and how they should be preparing for those men in that particular prison who are coming home and they're going to live next door to you, and they're going to be looking for work, and they're going to be, returning home to children and families. So we've got to do something around public communities. The media, of course, I think that's got to be a target in relation to how we challenge the media, but at the same time recognise that they're not going to go away. So how we engage them in as productive a way as we can, to not be so inflammatory sometimes, well, not sometimes, a lot of the time, in how they view and how they report around offenders, the prisons themselves, families, etc., etc. So yeah, this is a multi-pronged approach to targets, but I would certainly start on that potential local level, to getting people to understand who we are, what goes on in prisons, what happens there, what shouldn't happen there, and how we can begin to make it a better place.
Wonderful, thank you, Diane. Katuna, would you mind coming in now just to give us your reflections on the question? Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the person who asked this question. Just to add very briefly, I'm mindful of the time and to let you go at 11 o'clock. I think two things that really matter to me is talking to the people outside of my own communities. And I really want to make the issue of racial justice as a part of our societal problem. So we have to come to this together. There is no way we can pull this in silos and polarize ourselves. And the second point is the matter of representation. It is really sad to see that Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, but underrepresented in the decision-making processes. So I would love to have everything what our experts already said, just to add, keep attention on the representation and keep talking to people outside of our own comfort zones and those who we need to win their minds and hearts, as Kate said. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And as Katuna has indicated there, we're pretty much just about at time. We'll just have a couple of things to kind of say right at the end. But first of all, just to say an enormous thank you for everyone who's contributed to this session, all the panelists who I think have given us so much food for thought, so many brilliant ideas and interventions and kind of strategies in terms of how we can actually move forward. I've really appreciated everything that's been said today. I think it's been so well informed and exactly the kind of thing where we start with those kind of interventions in terms of moving forward. So I think it's been absolutely brilliant. Also to thank all the people who've given questions in and contributed. I think that's also been really, really valuable and obviously helped the shape and flow of the actual discussion itself. I just want to note that there is a kind of opportunity to donate for CCGS. And again, these kind of webinars are not, it is one for free, but obviously there's kind of various different factors and financial factors would go into the making and productions of events like this. So please be aware of the donation possibility and also to actually provide feedback. We always love to hear what people think. We get that directly, of course, through the Q&A and through the comments that people make, but it's also really good to have that feedback in terms of directly engaging with this webinar and indeed all the different webinars. So I'll just close this meeting by thanking you all very, very much and wishing you all the very best at these difficult times. And to say that this webinar will be back tomorrow with Richard chairing the sessions on issues around the notions of 30 years of injustice. So thank you all very much and take care and goodbye. Thank you.